questions you have. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. It's great to be here with you. And again, big thanks to Adam and the whole RAI team for welcoming us. It's great to be back after several years away. I'll quickly introduce the panel and we'll dive into the national security and foreign policy dimensions of the Biden presidency so far, moving toward the midterms. I'll start with Alex Betts, who is the Leopold Muller Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs and the William Golding Senior Fellow in Politics at Brasenose College, an associate head of the Social Science Division at Oxford. He served as Director of Refugee Studies Center between 2014 and 2017, and his research focuses mainly on the political economy of refugee assistance with a focus on Africa. Alex has co-authored and authored books with titles like Refugee, Transforming a Broken Refugee System, Survival Migration, Failed Governance and the Crisis of Displacement, Protection by Persuasion, International Cooperation in the Refugee Regime. So a lot of failure and a lot of crisis. Corey Shockey is Senior Fellow and the Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Before joining AEI, Corey was Deputy Director General of IISS. For those here in the UK, you don't need me to spell that out. For those watching from the United States, that's the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. She's worked at the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of Defense, and the National Security Council at the White House. She's taught at Stanford, West Point, Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and the National Defense University, and the University of Maryland, are one-time rivals at the University of Virginia, but not anymore. Corey is the author of America versus the West, Can a Liberal World Order Be Preserved? Safe Passage, the Transition from British to American Hegemony, State of Disrepair, Fixing the Culture and Practices of the State Department, and Managing American Hegemony, Essays on Power in a Time of Dominance. She's also co-editor, along with former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, of Warriors and Citizens, American Views of Our Military. Corey, it's great to have you with us here. And then our two Miller Center colleagues, David LeBlanc, that one is a Randolph-Compton professor, is the Randolph-Compton professor at the Miller Center, and is the Ambassador Henry Taylor and Marion Taylor Endowed Professor of Politics at the University of Virginia. He's also a professor of public policy at the Frank Back School of Leadership and Public Policy, where he directs the Global Policy Center. Like Alex Betts, he writes on migration and immigration, but also writes on cross-border capital flows and how the world tries to govern or sometimes fails to govern both of these issues, the movement of people and the movement of money. David has taught at the University of Colorado, the University of North Texas, the College of William and Mary. He's been a visiting scholar in the research department of the International Monetary Fund, the European Commission's Director of Economics and Finance. So David, great to have you with us here again.
Thanks.
And John Owen is a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow and also the Ambassador Henry Taylor and Marion Taylor Professor of Politics. Is that right?
Yeah.
There are two of us.
Yeah, we shouldn't use the definite article.
Yeah.
There,
Hey,
I got it, okay.
There are three.
He's the author of Liberal Peace, Liberal War, American Politics and International Security, The Clash of Ideas in World Politics, Transnational Networks, States and Regime Change, and co-editor of Religion, the Enlightenment, and the New Global Order. We may get to that religion stuff before too long in this conversation. So it's terrific to have them all here. And as Sid did in the first panel, I'll go around and just open with a basic framing question, which is, Biden started his first year with a series of inherited crises, many of which have an international dimension: the pandemic, the democracy crisis, and the climate crisis. Of those, he promised to return to a more traditional approach to government, a return to competence. How's that going? And are European and British assessments of those crises the same as in the US? And if they have the same competence challenge? So that's a lot to work with. Alex, why don't we start with you? Start with the home team.
Yeah, so looking at it from this side of the Atlantic, it's not looking as terrible as you might think. There's an awful lot that is in a great deal of mess over here. And I think when we look across the Atlantic, somewhat counterintuitively, probably from an American perspective, we see quite a lot of leadership and quite a lot of progress. We think back to kind of where we were in 2016, and there was a really severe and immediate crisis of democracy with rising populist nationalism on both sides of the Atlantic. And actually to have some semblance of stability, some semblance of coherence and consensus about engaging with global challenges, a revival of multilateralism looks like a stark improvement from a transatlantic perspective. I think the pandemic is being managed. Now, that's not because of the Biden administration. It's partly because progress in vaccinations, the dynamics of the pandemic, but nevertheless, things have settled. That allows a degree of progress to be made. When it comes to issues like climate change, COP26, Glasgow, general failure. But again, it's an area where Europe is struggling to provide that leadership. And to some extent, what we see from the Build Back Better Act, what we see from the commitment to net zero by 2050, these are major steps forwards in terms of American leadership. What we see with the Ukraine crisis, while we see Germany and the European Union dithering, we see some decisive messaging and a commitment of a significant amount of investment on the military side, on the humanitarian side to Europe. So I think while many of us may be here to kind of say it's not perfect, it doesn't look all that bad.
Corey, and I made a mistake. It wasn't Sid that asked the first question. It was Garrett in the last panel. So thank you, Garrett, for leading me. Corey.
Yeah, so I agree. I think this comparison to the tumult of the Trump administration, like the relief of a little boring competence is enormous. And an American president who isn't lighting fires every place he goes actually is a huge improvement. And while I understand why a lot of internationals are worried about American democracy, I think the president's election and the capacity of the FBI to investigate, to bring cases against almost 800 people from the January 6th insurrections, and the kind of tamping down by excluding the disgraced former president from social media, it does feel like a return to a sort of predictable bad problems, right? Derek Chalet, who's the counselor at the State Department, and I used to, during the Trump years, give a lot of talks together. And we would both say, we can't wait to return to disagreeing about stuff because democracy in America is not in peril in the same way. And I do think President Biden has done that, right? A lot of mistakes, the debacle of Afghanistan, the unwillingness to come up with a trade policy that assists, in particular, Asian countries to reduce their reliance on China. Like, there are things we can complain about, but they're inside the box of normal American administration failures. They're not the end of civilization. And that feels incredibly reassuring. And I think the president deserves a lot of credit for it. I also think he was elected to do that. And so.
David?
Yeah, so I'm going to agree and then disagree marginally. I think, the return to competence, the return to what I think is really quite dramatic and forceful leadership, especially economic leadership in response to Ukraine. It was the agreement among key countries for an economic boycott. It happened with speed and with fervor that I think surprised most observers. And so I think that is a huge achievement. Here's where I'll disagree a little bit. I think if we judge the Biden administration based upon the Trump administration, we can say, yes, it's more competent, right? It's within the kind of the box of standard operating procedure. But if we look at campaign promises, which we know are promises, or even actions immediately following the election, I think there are some dramatic missteps and some dramatic failures. So some of the first language, right, presidential releases that came out were about climate and the relationship between climate and migration, and then the US's policy with regard to the Northern Triangle, right? And so those documents were filled with promise. We're going to deal with climate because we know that this is a leading cause of displacement and migration. And as Alex said, COP was just a complete failure, and the United States has not moved past that in terms of policy. And likewise, in terms of the southern border and the Northern Triangle, the US has been, or the Biden administration, I should say, has been timid at best and fearful at worst. If we think about the failure to roll back Title 42, and we could say, look, this is, the courts got in their way, but they didn't even begin to whisper about reversing Title 42 until February, right? So this is almost a year and a half after taking office, did they begin the process of trying to wind that back. And to wind back remain in Mexico and the MVP and such. So I think in terms of the promise, specifically in the context of immigration, the Afghanistan, failure to resettle debacle is just a stark illustration of I think the Biden administration's overall, I don't want to say, I'm hesitant to say incompetence, but I might say disinterest in an area where I think they ran hard on, and I think that's where they garnered a lot of political support, that they weren't going to be the Trump administration on immigration, where I think they haven't been as different as they promised.
John?
Let me open just by saying, so good to be at the RAI. I was a fellow of this place in 2001 before there was a building in 2007, and it's just great. So thank you for your hospitality. Yeah, I'm a little more like David. So on this question, I think, look, first of all, let me separate competence from normality. And I think Biden certainly has restored the normal level of disagreement. I think over here, you don't get the feeling you got a few years ago that American democracy is crashing. Stay tuned in a few years and maybe we'll be back there. But so there are normal disagreements in the Atlantic Alliance, for example, within the United States. But I really think that Biden's competence is another question. I think he's gotten a great big assist from Russia and China on this. I think before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was a lot less. I wasn't as confident in that team. I lost a bit of confidence in the Biden team, and I really think it's an A team. It's very impressive people, but the debacle, the withdrawal from Afghanistan was not the withdrawal itself had to happen, but the way it was conducted. I think, and if you look at the autopsies of the thing, I think it was mishandled, a lot of miscommunication, and the military and some of the diplomats were saying, we can't do this like you're saying, and we did it anyway. Also, the AUKUS, which is mostly forgotten now, Australia, UK, United States, the submarine deal that sort of cut France out. That was a big deal. Maybe not in the UK, because it's good for the UK, but it's certainly a big deal in France, and other European allies were wondering what's going on here. Who Biden people? What are they doing after all? So that maybe all was forgiven. I don't know, but I really had questions. A lot of us had questions. That said, when it comes to Russia and Ukraine, the team has done extremely well from the late fall, early winter warning that the invasion was almost certainly going to happen, and kind of getting inside Putin's head and releasing information in a way that Intel usually doesn't do, right? Because they're afraid of compromising sources. Where did you get this information? Is there a mole? Are you able to read our signals? Well, yeah, the obvious answer is yes, we are, but we're going to try to get inside your head. And then having been right, unfortunately, having been right that Russia was going to invade Ukraine, my sense is that over here, there's a restored confidence that the Americans know what they're doing, that when most Europeans and Ukrainians were dismissive of the probability of the proposition that Russia was about to invade Ukraine, the fact that U.S. intel was right, it adds this luster to of the United States. So I think there's been a pretty quick turnaround. So I don't mean to denigrate the idea that there's competence. It's just it looked different, I think, until February 24th.
I want to drill down on one follow-up question there because it reminded me of something that we spent some time at the Miller Center, which is first years are often complicated. Oddly enough, with the exception of the Trump administration, which had no national security disaster in the first year, the possible exception of the ban on Muslims in the first weeks, which was not well handled and managed, but didn't lead to death of American soldiers. You can go back to the Bay of Pigs. In President Bush 41's first year, there was a failed coup in Panama. In President Clinton's first year, there was Mogadishu Black Hawk Down. In President Bush 43's first year was the shoot down of a spy plane off the coast of China that was not particularly well handled by the administration. So I'm just curious, how bad was Afghanistan as a first year? In two regards. One was how badly handled was it? But two, often what you see in these administrations when they have a crisis and they botch it, and they're often inheriting it from a previous administration and then changing something. How well do they learn? You know, I think about the Bush 41 first year where were you in the Bush 41 administration at that point? The failed coup in Panama led to a look at internal processes, and good thing he did, because a month later the Berlin Wall fell, and that may be the greatest diplomatic achievement in American history since the end of World War II. So, how bad was it, and how much did they learn?
I can just infer. It's almost a black box to me because I don't really know what. But what I've read about the Afghan debacle included something like the following: that it was inherited from the Trump administration. In fact, Biden delayed the withdrawal. Trump wanted to do it in the spring, and Biden delayed until September 11th, the symbolic date, 20th anniversary of 9/11 attacks. That makes symbolic sense. And so I really don't want to portray this as Biden created this problem. It's all his fault. But he also was a skeptic of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan. We know that. So he and Trump don't agree on much. They did agree on this, right? It seems like one thing they ought to have learned. I'm not sure I assume they did. They ought to have learned is that when the military are saying, well, we can, if you want us to do this, we can either close Bagram Air Base, we can close the embassy. We can't keep both open. And and then you have this team of diplomats writing independently extraordinary letter to the White House saying this is not going to work the way you think it is, and they did it anyway. So I think one thing to learn is listen to the Pentagon, listen to the Joint Chiefs, listen to military intelligence. The early intelligence estimates on Afghanistan was that the government of Kabul could make it for at least 2 years. As the summer wore on, those estimates began to shrink to a matter of weeks, which in fact turned out to be accurate. But the administration just doubled down. And I understand why. I'm sure my guess is Joe Biden has said, there's never a good time to do this. We just need to do it. But the thing is, you can still adjust. You still have to update. And it sounds like to me they didn't update. So it seems like maybe they, again, inferring from the outside, have better communication, a better interagency process, more listening. And because I do think they have performed so much better in calendar 2022. Yeah, but I'm speculating.
I'm going to go to Corey first.
Yeah.
And come back to you guys, particularly on the refugee and resettlement dimensions of Afghanistan and now into Ukraine.
So Afghanistan, it really is that bad. All of the major mistakes of the Biden administration are things driven by the president's own fundamental beliefs, right? He didn't believe Afghans deserved our intervention. The kinds of things the president was saying as Afghanistan was falling about if they won't fight for their country, we shouldn't, were disgraceful and were driven by the president's prior beliefs. The belief that the military had boxed in President Obama on Afghanistan, and therefore he wasn't going to listen to what they were going to tell him about the timing of any withdrawal. The willingness to ignore NATO allies' concerns, right? The allies were unified that fair enough if we're going to leave Afghanistan, but we need a trajectory of 6 months. We need to get through this fighting season. And the president was confident he knew better. The foreign policy for the middle class, which near as I can tell is simple trade protectionism. Again, that's a fundamental belief of the president, and there's no way they can get their China strategy to work without resolving that, and they still won't resolve it. So I think Afghanistan was in particular a devastating dent in the belief that this is an administration of calm, competent professionals, because they obviously weren't on them. And so the administration, I mean, Jake Sullivan gave an interview in the New York Times in which he said, I don't want to be judged just by Afghanistan. So they're practically turning cartwheels that they got a major international crisis that they didn't cause, that they can show, they can get everybody lined up, that they actually have an economic strategy, that they can lead with diplomacy, that they can do innovative things on declassification of intelligence, and demonstrating the vulnerabilities of closed societies. That a reminder that, you know, we've been so worried that our adversaries are preying on the openness of free societies. But in fact, the openness of free societies has a lot of advantages, not least, despite the difficulty of getting consensus. Once you win the public argument, democratic societies are much more adherent to policies that they agree. And you see that now as costs are going up on the isolation of Russia from the international economy. So it also helps that almost all of the senior people in the Biden administration are actually Europeanists, right? They all worked in European jobs. They know how the EU works. They understand what's going on, the way institutions can be leveraged. And it's difficult to believe that they would do as well in a crisis in Asia, where they seem to think meetings equal policy. So they'll have a much more difficult time in other places where they can't leverage their existing expertise. But they've done well on Ukraine, really well on Ukraine. And you can see them correcting their mistakes. So for example, weapons that should have been flowing to Ukraine in November that the administration wouldn't send because their internal theory of the case was that Ukraine would lose the war in a couple of weeks. They did actually adapt that frame of reference, and you can see it, the finesse of, well, we're only going to send defensive weapons. And to quote Jim Mattis, he's been shot at with both kinds. And see the difference.
So let me just stick with that for a second. So that's really interesting that maybe they learned at first the wrong lesson from Afghanistan, which is if the Ukrainians lose, the Russians grab our weapons the way we lost our weapons to the Taliban. We can't do that again.
That's exactly.
But now they've turned. Did they miss? I want to pick up something you said earlier too, Corey, where you said it was a disgrace on turning our back on the Afghanis that were fighting for their own freedom. It's a restatement and slight rephrasing of what you said. But wouldn't one takeaway from Afghanistan be that there simply weren't enough of them to win, and that there were some Afghanistans who wanted to fight for their freedom, but Ukraine has proved that it takes mobilizing an entire society to defend themselves. What are we missing there?
What I think you are missing is the extent to which Afghan security services and the Afghan society were making progress. Right? Afghan security services took incredible casualties. There hadn't been an American or allied soldier killed in Afghanistan in the last 2 years of our involvement, because we had in 2014 stepped back from involvement in operations and were just providing assistance, air cover, and reassurance, which actually makes a huge difference in people's willingness to fight. If you think you're going to lose, you don't fight. If you think you're going to win, you might. The other thing is, Ukraine had been a successful country. It had traditions of local governance it's a different circumstance in Afghanistan. And I think what President Biden did that I'm so critical of is disrespect what Afghans had been committing. There were still huge numbers of Afghans signing up for their security services, although they were taking enormous casualties, because they believed in an Afghanistan that was different and better than the trajectory Afghanistan is now going to be on. So the hard work had already been done in Afghanistan by outsiders, and the hard work was being done by Afghans themselves.
So how, to Alex and David, how have we treated those folks? It's kind of a softball, but it doesn't seem very good, right? We bailed and then we made it hard for them to get out.
Yeah, so I mean, on Afghanistan, I very much agree with the analysis. I think even if strategically you thought, okay, this is not sustainable in the long term, the US and NATO have to withdraw at some point. Tactically, the way it was implemented was sudden, abrupt, unnecessary, and burned huge sunk costs. The investment over 2 decades that had gone into a strategy to keep the Taliban out of power, to build civil society, to build the capacity of the Afghans in terms of security, in terms of governance, that was squandered. And that is not good foreign policy, to invest over 2 decades, to make a commitment, and then just overnight squander it. Even if you thought, okay, this isn't viable, the US can't be an occupying power indefinitely, we can't prop up something that's not working, the sequencing was abrupt, rash, and wasteful. Now, obviously, the immediate legacy of that is the humanitarian and human rights consequences. I think when we look at it with hindsight, perhaps the humanitarian and human rights consequences may not be quite as catastrophic as we imagined they might be at the point of the fall of Kabul.
Oh, thank goodness.
But I think that's partly luck rather than good judgment, right? So had we had millions of people moving into Pakistan, Iran, moving across via Turkey to Europe, then I think there would have been a much more critical judgment. Had we seen large-scale massacres by the Taliban, again, I think there would have been much more criticism. In a way, the administration gets lucky, because at the time, a lot of very thoughtful commentators were saying this could be a humanitarian catastrophe, this could be a human rights catastrophe, and the one thing that has proven correct is it's certainly set back Afghanistan by decades in terms of its democratic progress, its economic progress, and the capacity to attain basic rights, including women's rights and the participation of women within society. We see that the Taliban obviously hasn't committed to what it said it would do. It continues to exclude women from schools, from education, from public life, and we see a doubling down on those traditional Taliban policies, despite the rhetoric of its Doha-based international leadership. What we've seen is, yes, people fleeing, predominantly educated elites, people who were connected with the US, with NATO allies, elite women who were educated, had degree education, were in public service roles. They have had to move into exile. And essentially what that leaves behind is something that is challenging economically, that will leave a lot of people in poverty and very difficult human rights circumstances indefinitely. Now, the one area that was relatively well done was the evacuation of those people who had an immediate connection to the administration or the allies. And that was kind of the minimum you'd expect, right? The thing that was done particularly poorly was support for everyone else. Humanitarian evacuation for people whose lives were threatened as a result of that choice, resettlement opportunities for people who were threatened as a result of those choices. Now, in the aftermath of the fall of Kabul, there was a lot of discussion about resettlement programs that would get people out of Pakistan and Iran. Now, the premise of that is that people can get to Pakistan and Iran, and there are great limitations on people's ability to do that. A lot of people have been involuntarily immobile and unable to leave the country. Even in the context of Pakistan, for instance, getting access to embassies, getting access to meaningful resettlement claims, the functionality of the international architecture to register people has been really challenging. And so while there was an initial commitment to resettlement, we haven't seen the numbers. They've been tiny in implementation. And that comes to a kind of broader question, which is what commitments to refugees look like in the administration. And there, it's been iterative, slow, as David said. There's been quite a lot of continuity from the Trump administration. But I think one thing we've got to recognize is that the Trump administration absolutely decimated resettlement infrastructure. It went down to 18,000 resettlement places a year, which is the smallest it's been basically in US civilized history. 18,000 places. But it wasn't just that, it was the evisceration of the infrastructure, affecting the capacity of the administration, affecting the capacity of NGOs to be able to do all the things you have to do resettlement. To get numbers up to 120,000 a year, the progressive left in the Democrats would say, actually, that's not good enough. It's happened slowly, but it's something. The commitment to welcome Ukrainians, whether they can deliver it or not, is positive in the context of the huge damage the Trump administration did to that architecture. The Trump administration wasn't appointing people to the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration in the State Department. They've had to rebuild from scratch. And so I think there are attempts to move in a progressive direction, but overly cautious in a way where there's a lack of leadership. You mentioned Jake Sullivan, and I think he's an example of someone in the administration who exudes thoughtful competence, and it's worth saying is an Oxford alumnus, a Rhodes Scholar here in the contemporary mind, as many in the administration have to be. But the immigration piece, I think, lacks that level of leadership. And it's hard to lead, right? Because it covers State Department, USAID, Homeland Security, joining those up and coming up with something coherent, where resettlement isn't looked at in isolation, but it connects to root causes approaches in the Northern Triangle, where you have a joined up, coherent national refugee policy linked to an immigration policy. That's never existed in US history. And so to expect that leadership might be too much, but I think the leadership has been pretty weak in that space.
David, let me then steer this back to you. I am struck in looking at recent public opinion polling that the top four issues are the economy, inflation, that's not surprising, the war in Ukraine, crime, and immigration. So two of the four are at some level national security issues. Given that, why haven't the Biden people been focusing on these issues, particularly at the border?
That's a terrific question, and I won't pretend to have an answer. Let me give you some conjecture. Okay, so some conjecture here is that the Republicans have done a fairly effective job of conflating immigration with crime, right? So the narrative, if you listen to Governor Abbott of Texas, right, or the governor of Arizona, or DeSantis, right? Even though very few migrants are coming into Florida, the narrative is that migration, especially undocumented migration, equals crime. Okay, and as a pro law enforcement, anti-crime party, the Republicans are able to seize on that. I think they've been less successful in doing what the Republican Party of 20 years ago did in talking about migrants as a drain on the welfare state, right? That migrants are problematic because of the fiscal consequences. I think now they're framing it more in terms of security, right? Individual security. So I think that's part of it. And it is really quite fascinating, to think that immigration today, I'm stunned by the Biden administration treating migration as the third rail, the new third rail of American politics. For so long it had been Social Security, nobody's going to touch Social Security. And now it's like, well, nobody's going to mess with the border, right? And to feed into a narrative, the Republicans talk about there being an open border and the Democrats are pro-open border, and then they tout how many apprehensions there are, right? If you have an open border, you don't apprehend anybody, right? So it doesn't make any sense, but the narrative is one where they can say all these people are trying to come in, and they are coming in, even though they're apprehended. So I think it does catch the administration a bit flat-footed, because the public, I believe, doesn't understand distinctions between legal migration, asylum claims, and then refugees. So, Alex, I think is exactly right about the refugee machinery. The Trump administration from day one said, we're going to dismantle any process that there is for resettlement, and we're going to not only remove immigration judges, those who would hear asylum cases, but we're not going to fill those seats, right? So the backlog increases dramatically. When there's a backlog of people who have a legitimate claim to asylum, or at least want to make the claim to asylum, the expectation on the part of whether it's the Trump administration or whether it's Frontex in the EU, if we protect the border, we assume they're not going to come. Of course they're going to come. They're not going back home. They'll just try and enter through a different mechanism. So on the southern border of the United States, it's a movement from asylum, which I should emphasize is a legal right, right? The United States under international law is obligated to recognize people's asylum claim. Title 42 through that lens is an abrogation of international law, right? We can set that aside for now, but those folks aren't going back home, right? They're going to try and enter in different kinds of ways, right? So what does the Biden administration do when they say we're tough on immigration, right? We're not going to walk back Title 42, or we're going to think about immigration through different kinds of lenses. But I think politically the die has been cast to some extent. And I think that's problematic. Let me make one more point with regard to what Alex was saying in terms of Afghanistan. Here's where I'm going to differ just a little bit in terms of interpretation. I agree completely that the machinery necessary to deal with humanitarian response is dismantled and it is missing. Where I think the United States has burned an enormous amount of international credibility is in the failure to resettle SIVs, right? Those who would receive special immigrant visas. Here we're talking about people who work with the US military, either as contractors, interpreters, etc., right? And there are tens of thousands, if not 100,000 of them and their families who had been promised resettlement in the US, both from Afghanistan and from Iraq. The Trump administration put the brakes on that, right? So violating, basically breaking a promise. And the failure to withdraw those folks or have a plan for the resettlement of those folks who had worked with the United States upon withdrawal, we will only see what the repercussions of that are in years to come. But I think that's both a policy failure and a moral failure on the part of the U.S.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's also hard not to see the different treatment that 100,000 Ukrainians that the Biden administration is enthusiastically welcoming to the United States, and the treatment of Syrian refugees, Honduran refugees,
Yep.
And Afghan refugees. I mean, there's a strong racial undercurrent that the Biden administration the Trump administration made explicit, but the Biden administration has bought into the continuation.
I would like to ask Alex about that, if that's the same here in Europe as well.
So, I mean, there's clearly a privileging of Ukrainians over and above refugees from other parts of the world. And I think it comes back in part to, David, your point about the association with security of refugees, asylees, and immigrants in the United States. And that link is not just between immigration and security, it's between immigration, Islam, and security. And that Islamophobic undertone means the degree of vetting that the US public expects is much higher and perhaps disproportionate. And even though the data tells us that the likelihood of terrorist attacks from Islamic resettled refugees is very, very historically low, the public belief means that few presidents want to take the risk in expanding those numbers. And so I think the caution is in that context of the undertones of that public debate. Whereas Ukrainians, white, European, Christian, it's a throwback to the Cold War era, where actually kind of warmest embrace we've seen in the US was resettlement for people voting with their feet to move east to west. It was a way of discrediting the Soviet Union. And it wasn't just a temporary resettlement, it was permanent long-term integration for those who wanted to flee to the democratic West and leave behind tyranny and authoritarianism in the East. And so I think there's a sort of historical lurch back to that. It's almost instinctive for the American public and the US government to say, this is what we do. Of course, when we've got this sort of Nietzschean good versus evil US Russia within the mindset of the Cold War, we should resettle and help Ukrainians. Now, it's not obviously the same as is the Cold War, but I think it's very easy to lurch back into that mindset and know that there'll be resonance with the public. And there has been that resonance and that obvious commitment. Now, in part, it's similar in Europe, but I think the Cold War undertones have been less strong. In Europe, it's been, okay, this is geographical proximity plays a massive role. We don't have any choice. People are coming across the border. What are we going to do? Close down the Polish border and have very visible media footage of the exclusion of vulnerable women and children attempting to. That wasn't an option. So Europe has had to adapt. But having said that, we've seen, I think, enormous double standards all across Europe. I mean, we think about the Polish border with Ukraine versus the Polish border with Belarus. Immediately before the crisis, sort of January, early February, we saw people from Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan coming via Belarus, trying to enter Europe via the Polish border. And they would raise wire fences, armed border guards, military police. And we also see the contrast with, say, the Central Mediterranean, where if you're an African asylum seeker, well, you face detention, deportation, the threat of drowning, return to Libyan detention centers. So this Ukrainian moment can't be understood as a sort of universal commitment to the rights, the human rights of refugees, the rights to asylum in international law. It is very specific to everything we know about historical geopolitical commitments to refugees. There's a strategic interest attached to it. They have the right racial, religious, and educational profile. And so that proximity in terms of identity, plus that geostrategic foreign policy interest, means we are favoring Ukrainians. But for me, as someone interested in this space, that I think is a cause to step back and say, well, what are we really doing in our refugee policies?
Mm-hmm. So, John, let me ask you in broad liberal world order terms, how does this movement of people fit in? And for the Biden administration, as an administration and a president who wanted to return to the role of democracies, starting with asylum policy, but even more broadly, the free flow of people. Is this a limiting factor? Is it part of the social compact among liberal democracies that, yeah, at some level you still can and should control your borders?
Yeah, the way I think about it, it's a profound question. I want to back up and say, first of all, it's clear to me that President Biden has, as I think, his central priority, defending the democracy at home and abroad. I think that he talks about it a lot, deeply motivated by this. The National Defense Strategy has not been, the real document hasn't been made public, but we have lots of information about it. And it talks about this. It talks about China as the pacing challenge, partly because it's authoritarian. Russia kind of grouped in there as the biggest challenge in Europe because it's partly because it's authoritarian. And so, and there's a real emphasis you see in the Biden administration on, we get out of Afghanistan, but we go in, not to fight for Ukraine, but we are definitely in that war. Russia is not wrong that the US is a, arsenal democracy, almost a co-belligerent. And that, so what that tells me, all this fits together in my mind as follows, that President Biden really believes that democracy had a close call recently, maybe not like the 1930s, which was a near-death experience, but a close call. And so it's time to pull together for the mature, constitutional, wealthy democracies to pull together because President Trump was dividing them. He was more comfortable with Vladimir Putin or Erdogan or Bolsonaro in Brazil than he was with Angela Merkel, Theresa May, whomever. That we have to stop that. So what this means, so the good part about that is, again, if you're in Europe or Canada or Japan, it looks like, good times are back and the Americans are reasonable again, and they understand the challenges, but there is a kind of exclusion implicit possibly, right? That this is maybe not for everyone right now. The United States got deeply burned in Iraq and Afghanistan. So maybe those parts of the world aren't ready for this, and you're not going to hear this explicated, right? I'm just inferring from what I see in a macro sense. So in other words, a tightening of the democratic community, but it's really the wealthy liberal democracies who already have the institutions in place. There's not much, there's some problems, Hungary, Poland, right? There are problems there, but I mean, this is basically a club of countries that are on this roughly the same page. But so in other words, to bring this back to the movements of people, Ukraine was a mess. Let's not kid ourselves. Ukraine was not even a liberal democracy, but it's shown itself to be an aspiring, especially since the war started, an aspiring democracy. Even Russian speakers, as far as we can tell, the majority of Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine have decided we're not Russian. We're Ukrainian. We like Zelensky. We want to be a Western European country. And so that, and it's possible, it's going to take a lot of effort. It's possible in the next few decades, Ukraine could become that, or something like that. So Ukraine is a possible member of this club that I'm pointing to, right? Other Middle Eastern countries, no, they're out of luck. Turkey's a kind of an interesting, Turkey's always on the margin between the West and the East. And so I think one country to look at in the coming years is Turkey, and how Turkey and the United States get on, because it's very tricky. But anyway, my larger point, I think, is clear that a tightening of the wealthy democracies, but a loosening of connections maybe to the others. And you're seeing that in the way other democracies, particularly India, are responding to the war in Ukraine. India is not on board. Brazil, these big democracies, South Africa, the big democracies, not seeing the same thing that the Europeans, the North Americans, the Japanese are seeing.
So Corey, I want to steer this back to you. We saw Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell bring a delegation to Ukraine. And yet, I think it was just yesterday, I can never remember where I read things and where I see things. Tucker Carlson asked, what is NATO for anyway, who really, when people say they're pro-NATO, what do they believe? Tell us a little bit about the internal debates in the Republican Party about the state of the democratic world order and the role of the United States should play. What do we need to know about that?
I think John already perfectly captured it, which is that our disgraced former president and the faction of my fellow Republicans who support him fundamentally democracy and human rights don't actually resonate with them as core American foreign policy values. They would like to think of themselves as hard-headed realists who are just advancing American interests. But that covers a lot of sins.
Infinite.
One of the things that I think came out so strongly in the first panel was how much the American public, the truths we hold to be self-evident, we very often hesitate to think they're universal. But if you watch the American public's reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's a very strong rush to consensus that people have rights, they loan them in governments in limited ways, that states should have sovereignty, and that our values should be the only things that are allowed to intrude on that sovereignty, because those values are universal. And the point from the panel this morning that our disgraced former president and other people around him, their reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, to act as though Ukrainians aren't inherently morally superior in this equation, right? They have jettisoned Reagan's belief that there's a fundamental moral difference between defense and aggression. And it's discrediting politically So I'm weirdly hopeful that one of the advantages of Ukraine winning the war of its sovereignty will be the further discrediting of the Trumpist wing, because actually that's not where my mom is on this. And most Americans aren't there either.
If I could just ask you to not necessarily play an expert on American domestic politics, but you probably can see ahead to the next 6 months to a year of what this war might be and what it will require of the United States, supplying arms, supplying perhaps more intelligence, more advisors on the ground. While a peace negotiation may be somewhere in the future, it's going to involve a lot of American engagement between now and then. Will the shift toward a more internationalist voice for the Republican Party, do you think it will sustain? Do you think Republicans will stand by all of those things, say through the not to again make it too political, through the midterm and maybe through the 2024 election?
Hard to say, because the live under a bridge wing of the Republican Party, the performative artists of the Republican Party, Marjorie Taylor Greene and people like that, are campaigning against the $40 billion supplemental for Ukraine, arguing now in a very nativist way that we should be spending that money on Americans and other people. But really that plays into President Biden's argument about Afghanistan, right? Other people don't deserve our help. And the president is himself failing to make the case that sustaining an international order that we and our friends built out of the ashes of World War II to give ourselves greater prosperity and safety is worth those sacrifices, is worth $6 a gallon of gas temporarily. And I think the administration begins to understand they're going to have to make that argument. I don't know if you saw the collection that the president sent to Mohammed bin Zayed's elevation, or to the funeral of the head of state of the UAE, but it was the Secretary of State, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, John Kerry. Like, he just poured buckets of American establishment elites, because the UAE and Saudi Arabia and other oil producing countries are not particularly interested in the president's framing of democracy versus autocracy as the fight of our time.
And we need their oil, and we need it.
Yeah, exactly.
They especially need it in advance of the midterm election.
Alex, before we lose you, any closing thoughts for us on this panel? Because I know we're going to lose you.
I think just building on Corey's point, I think Putin in a way has given a gift of an opportunity to Biden and the West broadly concede. This was one of the most unifying things you could have for Western liberal order at a time when fragmentation was appearing within the European Union, within NATO, in terms of the transatlantic alliance, with my own island nations sort of fading relevance in the international community after Brexit. I think Putin underestimated the extent to which this would be unifying and the speed with which the US would play a leadership role in bringing about that unity. That really matters, and it's important to sustain, because I think we see in the background China, we see the ambivalence of other BRICS, and that means we're reaching a point where we no longer have that unipolar world order with American leadership being something we can take for granted. We no longer have that unity that we can take for granted. And it's going to be increasingly important with China's growing global influence that the West is assertive and strategic in how it projects its values of democracy, liberalism, multilateralism. And I think this is something where there needs to be an even greater realization that if that is to sustain, and if the challenge of China is going to be warded off, and China's rising influence is going to be managed in a way that doesn't undermine Western authority around the world, we need to take this moment of unity and move it forwards. So NATO and its increasing prominence is important to that. It's reassuring to see Sweden and Finland wanting to join. It's the United Nations is massively under threat. Its equivocation in the context of Ukraine is self-evident. They need Russia to function. Contexts like Syria rely upon Russian involvement. So the United Nations is continuing dialogue with Russia in order to be able to do anything on Syria. And equally, parts of the US administration are very aware of the importance of Russia. So I think my sort of final thought, before I have to head off, unfortunately, has to be that on a global scale, the Biden administration has to realize that this is a really historically defining milestone moment for Western liberal order. And we need to ensure that the legacy of the relative success of the way we've managed Ukraine, irrespective of the trajectory of the conflict, is something where we've got to lock in those alliances and set a leadership agenda for the 21st century.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for joining us for that,
Thank you.
that observation. Somewhat hopeful. David, to you, if we were having this conference, say, 8 years ago, we might be talking about globalization. Globalization was being challenged, particularly in the context of China. We were in the earliest stages of trade competition and what became at some level a trade war with our biggest global trading partner. And it's only gotten worse. The combination of managing COVID and who started COVID, but now also China at least leaning very aggressively toward Russia, if not in complete partnership with Russia in the war in Ukraine. How's that all going? Is globalization broken? And can we expect the Biden administration to put Humpty Dumpty back together again?
I think it's hard to break globalization, right? I think globalization ebbs and falls. You know, as we think about globalization as the movement of people, capital, and goods, right? And so when we see COVID, what COVID did is it laid bare how sensitive or vulnerable different economies are to being exposed in different areas. So, you know, I don't know that pre-COVID, you know, high school kids would say supply chains, right? You know, when they got home from class, right? But now if they don't know about supply chains, then somebody in their either high school government or econ class is failing them. Okay. And so I think the recognition, the kind of the visceral recognition about the importance of where a silicon chip or, you know, this last week baby formula is produced is something that, you know, we have these moments where whether it's the United States or other countries thinks hard about, we need to make sure that we have an internal supply of X. Okay, that is not, in my view, does not mean that we are becoming less globalized. It means that we are diversifying our sourcing of X, Y, or Z. Okay, you know, if I think about the mechanisms of globalization, you know, we still, I mean, trade is still sky high, right? We still know about vulnerabilities. I think about the Ukraine crisis, and we've had these conversations before. When I think about the Ukraine crisis, I think about what this means for countries in Africa that rely on wheat or fertilizer that's produced in the Ukraine, Russia, or Belarus. You know, we are going to see starvation on the scale of you know, pre-Arab Spring starvation, I believe, because of the disruption in supply of grain. But at the same time, we have international organizations like the WFP, the World Food Program, and the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, that are working tirelessly to help develop indigenous production, right? Is that the end of globalization? It may be a shift in terms of, are we importing grain, or are we importing expertise? Are we importing technology in order to fend for ourselves? You know, we've seen a decoupling of sorts, again, going back to immigration. You know, the Trump administration started this in the United States. I think Brexit started it in the UK. So it had nothing to do with Russia, China, or COVID. It was partisanship. It was populism, I should say, right? That made us want to restrict the mobility of individuals to move from place to place. But I think we're also recognizing that there are opportunities from travel. I know we all can take advantage of that, but also thinking hard about how one might use the cross-border movement of people strategically. I've read a number of commentators, and I agree with the sentiment. One of the smartest things that the US or the UK or the EU could do would be to instantly provide a visa to any Russian scientist or any Russian or Ukrainian with a college degree, right? How better to fight Putin than to steal human capital, right? I think it's a marvelous idea. Will it happen? No. But it's something where, again, we think about taking advantage of globalization in a way to bolster the strategic interests of whatever state we're talking about.
So let me ask you that, David. Is there a simple description of a Biden policy toward globalization? Or is it balkanized on a range of different issues? Immigration, trade, finance, Ukraine. Is it?
I would have to say it's balkanized. I mean, I think the effort, the most and here again, the language is thorny. I think, Corey, you mentioned it in your opening statement when you talked about some multilateral successes with regard to the Ukraine. I have trouble separating multilateral cooperation on sanctions from thinking about globalization, right? Why do we see countries willing to go along with sanctioning, and especially the decision to not import fuel from Russia is going to bring about enormous hardships to consumers in Europe, right? And then to politicians, right? So we have to look at the political fallout that will accompany this. That may be made up at the margins in terms of availability of alternative fuels that would not have been available absent globalization. Okay, and so when we think about multilateralism, I have trouble kind of disentangling.
So it is kind of Ukraine, right? The coalescence of NATO.
I think it is.
The creation of largely a liberal democratic economic order around Russia.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because TPP, the Biden administration priority, was a liberal economic order in Asia around China that failed to pass a domestic politics test, and yet doing it in opposition to Russia appears to be succeeding. Or do I have that wrong?
So one of the really interesting, I'm on the board of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs surveys of American public attitudes. And one of the really interesting things is Americans are overwhelmingly in support of trade, even to the degree where 80% of Americans will answer, trade is good for my household economy. They get the consumer side of it. President Biden doesn't.
Yeah.
He's fundamentally a trade protectionist. He thinks it costs American jobs. He thinks it reduces American wages. He has a vision of the American economy that's the United Auto Workers in about 1950. And a belief that manufacturing has left the United States because of China. And it's actually precisely the kind of innovation that the president says he supports that makes manufacturing less human intensive in the United States. So it's a willful misreading of global economics that the president's engaged in. And the American public actually knows better. The problem is that party activists now in both political parties are anti-trade.
But
So we actually have an elite problem. We don't have a public problem.
I want to see if I could cut a middle path here based on some reading I've been doing lately, which is to say the world might be redividing into two camps. Right? I don't know how far that this can go with this decoupling word you've been hearing for years. But some I guess China, Russia. China has the Belt and Road Initiative. It's building its own block, whether it even knows it or not. It's going to take a long time to be up and running. Russia is weakening itself to such an extent that it's going to be a vassal of China. It's going to need to sell oil and gas to China because the Europeans aren't going to buy it anymore. And so, and we are, in the way the West is sanctioning Russia, we're giving China lots of incentives to build up a parallel international political international economic war, I should say. Whether they can do that or not, I don't know. It's requires technical knowledge I don't possess, whether China can do this, but we're giving them incentives to do this. That coupled with the disruption to supply chains has led to a phenomenon I think some are calling terrible term, friendshoring. I hate these words, but this is useful. So there's offshore, you offshore production, then you reshore or onshore it. But what about friendshoring? What about friendly countries? Democracy. Here again, democracies, constitutional democracies that are basically on the same page and more reliable. Some of them are in dangerous neighborhoods like Taiwan. You know, Taiwan leads the high performing semiconductor industry, but it's a very friendly country to the US and the West. So why don't we focus on supply chains in those countries and start to cut out unfriendly or less reliable countries? So that's not globalization. The globe is the entire globe by definition, except I guess Antarctica. But this is an international trading order. It's more like the closest analogy I have is the Cold War, when you had the liberal international order actually wasn't global. It was international. International just means between two or more countries. It doesn't mean global. Globalization comes into play in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapses. I mean, there were previous rounds of globalization, but that's really hyper-globalization. Maybe the world is stepping back from what Donnie Roger calls hyper-globalization to a more regional or regime-specific, but still international. And I don't know, this is big picture speculation, but you can see signs of this, and you can see lots of incentives, both on the side of what I'll call the West for convenience, but also on China's side, right? China doesn't want the United States and Europe to have the kind of leverage over them that we have been exhibiting over Russia. And you know, it's rational for them not to want that, and they don't.
It's rational for them not to want it because they want a different set of rules.
Exactly. They're authoritarian, and they want Taiwan at some point.
That's a great lead into to the rest of the world. There's a whole China-Taiwan question which we just touched on, and we could probably spend the rest of the session on, about 25 minutes or so. But there's also broader conflicts in the Middle East, Syria, Afghanistan, whatever happens there, Iran and the nuclear agreement. There's India, which has been sitting on the fence about Ukraine after years of flirtation with the United States, Japan, and Australia about being in containment of China. And this actually puts a really interesting question on that in both directions. And then there's Latin America and Africa, which have been part of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which I'd say had still lingering interest in engaging with the West broadly, the United States and Europe. So each of you, give me a sense of where you think the administration has staked out some priorities in these other places and how they're doing. It's easy, I think. It's a big, complicated world, and they've gone from one crisis to the next. I think it's a little too easy to say, oh, they're failing in places A, B, and C. They've probably staked out a priority or two here that are worth focusing on. How are they doing on those?
I think they're actually doing well on the India portfolio. Ukraine's a particularly difficult thread for India because they have a near-term China military threat, right? China's killing Indian soldiers in the Himalayas and taking territory. Almost the entirety of India's military equipment is supplied by Russia. That's the constraint on India taking a position on Russia. It's not that they don't have, care for a democratic ballot. It's that they got a near-term problem that Russia holds leverage over. And what this will result in, I mean, one of the great benefits, again, of the war in Ukraine is nobody's going to buy Russian military equipment anytime soon. And so it's going to facilitate India's transition to buying French and Swedish. And so you are going to see further consolidation of the West. And I think the Biden administration has played this really well by not pressing India too hard on that.
It's interesting. If I can add a footnote on that, Indian nuclear reactors are all Russian design. And for years, we've been trying to sell them American. It's tied up in how we assure reliability, but they essentially have Chernobyl-style reactors. That's what they refer to them as. And India faces real energy shortages, and nuclear was a big part of their bet. So it'll be interesting to see if we do the same there, if we're willing to do what the
That's a
Indians
great
need.
point. And the interest in India, though, isn't just that they're a democracy. If you think you are going to have to fight a war with China, shutting down the Chinese economy becomes a near-term requirement, and shipments of oil pass through the Indian Ocean, and the Indian Navy is really good at its job. And so, right, you can build out a lot of good reasons for the relationship. I do think the administration's handling that well. And Vice President Harris is incredibly important in that, because the Indian American diaspora is increasingly active there. One of the many great success stories of American society. China continues to be the overwhelming priority for the administration. I personally think they're making mistakes there, partly by pressing on the democracy versus autocracy, because that loses you a lot of Asian countries that are worried about China, but either, like Vietnam, are not democracies, Singapore not democracies, or don't want a piece of that ideological argument, right? They want market access, they want secure supply chains, they want financing. China's become the world's largest lender through the Belt and Road Initiative, and there are good reasons that the Bretton Woods institutions wouldn't make those kinds of loans, because they're never going to be self-sufficient. And so we are going to have an enormous problem of failed Chinese BRI projects where the terms of the contracts, which have never been made public, give China control over major ports in the world, or and those countries are going to come to the United States and our allies asking for protection, asking for us to intervene in this. The World Bank and the IMF have already suggested that they will not accept China. They're not going to take over these loans because they wouldn't have given them in the first place. And so that's a big looming problem. The administration, Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, came out 2 days ago and said that the maximum window of risk for Taiwan is between now and 2030. The Biden administration's defense budget is built on eliminating a lot of procurement in the near term and investing in systems, which if we ever even buy them, we're not going to buy till 2035. So they are bad at defense policy because they don't actually care much about defense policy. And it's going to show up in China in big ways.
David?
Wow, let's see. I'm trying to think, like,
sucking the oxygen out
No,
of the
that's
conversation.
great.
I'm trying to think of what part of the world is left untouched from Corey's answer, right? Because I think Antarctica, North Korea, perhaps, right? We haven't talked about the North. I don't know. I mean, I think I one of the areas that I think is really essential, and Corey mentioned this within one context, is the area of sovereign debt. And I focus a lot on Latin America, both for migration reasons, but also because thinking about their history of sovereign debt, and because they are so dramatically exposed to international capital markets. So I'm very curious about both Belt and Road for debt reasons, but also thinking about these relationships with China and other countries, again, because so many of these countries are so heavily exposed to importers, right? And as things begin, I say it optimistically, as things begin to settle down in a post-COVID environment, again, optimistically, I think we're going to see a lot more economic disruption, not just in Central America, but in South America. Venezuela pre-COVID was, to call it an economic basket case would be polite. And to see what happens to what was the 7th largest economy in the world not so very long ago, and then other important economies, that are its neighbors, Brazil, Argentina. So those are the things that again, I'm paying some attention to, especially because, you know, the populist politics in South America, you know, it's a populism of the left, so it's a more redistributive politics than the populism in the United States or in Europe, which is more right-wing populism. And so I think that there are opportunities for a Biden administration to try and consolidate it's too optimistic to say consolidate democratic hemisphere, but to try and support democratic movements in South America, right? The challenge there, you know, I look at Brazil, right? And if you'd asked me a year ago, say if you were to say, oh, you know, Lula's going to run, you know, for president, he's going to win, I'd say there's no way, guy's in jail, right? He's a crook, ain't no way, right? But he's leading in all the polls, right? And so
he's not as much of a crook as the guy that's currently.
Well, that's exactly right. So number one, don't ask me my predictions on Brazilian politics, but number two, the hard part again, this is, you know, we go back to Clinton administration and probably even before, thinking about how to establish commercial relations in a way that is supportive of democracy in countries that are just that are corrupt, right? And that there's no internal mechanism to try and weed the corruption out. And so I think that's a challenge, but that's a challenge that's potentially winnable. And you hang that in the win column for the Biden administration, that speaks to both economic and political stability, and perhaps a buffer against Chinese influence in the hemisphere.
John, is there a place in the world
Yeah, that's
where
what
you look and where you look and you see the Biden administration making some bets and paying off or not paying off?
Well, in fairness to the Biden administration, the Russo-Ukrainian war has just sucked away all the oxygen, attention. It's so big and complex. And before it happened, the Biden people were very attuned to the Belt and Road Initiative and the need to respond in some way. So I think they pay particular attention to Southeast Asia, which is obviously, you know, where the BRI started. It has countries that rely deeply on Chinese capital and Chinese markets and so on, but also are worried because they are very close to China. So opinion polls in the ASEAN countries generally show they don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. They will resist that choice, most of them. They want to rely, they're happy to be interdependent with China economically. They want the United States to protect them. They want the US Navy to be in the neighborhood still. So they want it both ways, and they've had it both ways for a while. They just want to keep that going. That said, the Biden administration has been also aware that China is trying to kind of hive off or pick ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries away from the United States. They had a bit of success in the Philippines with President Duterte, who's now leaving office. They've had less success than they wanted, but the Biden people want to respond and give Southeast Asia reasons not to throw in their lot completely with China. And I think that was a real focus of Biden, and it will be again. India, we've already talked about. They're also aware of heavy Chinese investment in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. It's not clear to me the Biden people or anybody has a real answer to that. The Chinese are putting so many resources into Africa. The U.S. does not have the bandwidth, the ability to compete, as far as I can tell. So that's just a big question mark. And Latin America has also been discussed. But my larger point is the Biden people are aware that it's a big world. The United States has global interests. They have, my sense is they have been trying to attend to these areas. They've paid more attention to South Asia and Southeast Asia than to others, setting aside Europe. But the war itself has just scrambled things, taken a lot of their attention away, put some of these countries in a position where they're thinking, we don't want to choose. We don't want to say we're with the Americans and against anybody else. And they're feeling some pressure to do that. The last thing I wanted to say was, we haven't talked about Japan, South Korea, Australia, this quad that I think somebody that you alluded to. that's interesting. It'll be interesting to watch this quad. You know, South Korea is interested in making it a quint, maybe, if I can use that word. And South Korea has been surprisingly to me, solid with Japan, North America, Europe on Russia and Ukraine. It's sort of like they're stepping up and saying, we are, you know, a mature, wealthy democracy now. There's certain expectations that come with that, but South Korea has a new government. It's right of center, very pro-American. And so, at least for the near term, I think what that means is the United States does have the makings of a fairly solid group of countries vis-a-vis China. India is the question mark now to some extent, but in any case, I think it's important to recognize these middle powers in Asia, just as we think about Europe, you know, the UK, France, Germany, they're analogs in Asia, and they're starting to wonder, do we have to choose between the United States or not? And sometimes it sounds like they are starting, the wealthy ones are starting to choose. Last point is they're all paying attention to, they're all thinking about what happens in 2024.
Well, I
They're
was
all thinking about that.
my closing question, as we have about 7 minutes left, is what happens in 2022? We have midterms, and what we heard from the last panel is likely to almost certainly Democrats lose the House, and we have Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Maybe not lose the Senate, and it's Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. Pick a topic here. We can start with Ukraine, but even some of the ones beyond that. Does it make a difference in foreign affairs? Or if so, where does it make a difference? All right, let's start with you.
I certainly think it will make a difference. It will make it much harder for the Biden administration to pass any legislation, which means more executive orders, as we saw, an increase in executive power that Democrats are very much in opposition to when they don't hold the White House. And justifiably, you know, we at AEI have a big program running under Yuval Levin on constitutional issues. And the big problem structurally is Congress's unwillingness for partisan reasons to exercise its constitutional authorities. And so a Republican-controlled Senate has the possibility of reasserting its constitutional prerogatives. But given the rise of entertainment Republicans, I think it's a real open question whether they will exercise that responsibly. We really actually have to win the argument within the Republican Party for the system to function.
Is there a foreign policy piece of that? Is there a place where Biden will go it alone on presidentialism, to use our friend Sid Milkus's phrase, in the national security realm and just blow by them? Will he have a partnership with Mitch McConnell as an internationalist against Kevin McCarthy as a more performative?
I'll tell you what I fear. I fear a return of Benghazi hearing sensationalism, which is profoundly bad for American foreign policy in all sorts of ways, in infantilizing our diplomats who very often work bravely in war zones, in getting Congress to put them behind barricaded embassies, like all of those things are bad. It looks to me like Mitch McConnell, even before the trip to Ukraine, is trying to reassert a sort of traditional Republican foreign policy of internationally engaged while feeling uncomfortable about international mandates. And trade policy is going to be the hard piece of that, because I think there's a big difference between Republicans in the Senate and Republicans in the House on trade policy. I think there will be trouble for Biden on multilateral climate policy, because I think Republicans are in a very different place. I think the general belief among the Biden administration that international institutions are net goods will come into question. But again, the Biden administration, the fact that Republicans are going to pick up probably 37 seats in the House has been knowable and known. And so the Biden administration ought to
It's not an
have
unknown is.
appointing
Yeah.
judges to the WTO adjudication mechanism, getting them through while you still have the votes in the Congress. And they have not done those things, and they're gonna regret it.
David?
Yeah, so let me be a little bit more optimistic and say that losing the Senate today, I don't think it's going to matter that much in terms of foreign international economic policy. Now, if you'd asked me this a few weeks ago, I would be of different minds. But the reappointment of Powell as chair of the Fed makes a huge difference, because I would bet that the Senate, there will be pressure to not appoint or confirm non-soft money. I don't want to say hard money, like people who are in favor of higher interest rates, right? And so I think that's where I think to strengthen the dollar matters a lot as we think about the ability of the United States to engage in and be persuasive on a variety of international economic issues. Given the stability of the chairman of the Fed and the members of the Fed, the Fed, I think we're going to see relatively consistent interest rate policy, which means relatively consistent and strong dollar policy, which is a net good, and it's not going to fluctuate based upon what happens in the House or in the Senate. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because we know that when U.S. financial markets are strong, the U.S. is strong at least to some extent, right, economically. And when the market is in turmoil, again, we know that is seen as an opportunity for, even if we think about economic warfare, right? The rapid demise and fall of crypto over the last 2 weeks as well, I think bodes well for the primacy or the continued primacy of the dollar, which again, I think we take for granted. And in some cases, we take for granted at our own risk. So again, I think we're in pretty good shape in that space. Agreed 100% about the international organization piece, right? I think that if and when we see a new variant come out, our inability to fund the WHO and the unwilling to stand up for global institutions, let's even set aside the politicization of the WHO if you believe it. It serves a monitoring and a surveillance role that is second to none, right? And if we can't do anything if we don't have data, right? And so we need the data. WHO needs to be funded. And so I think that's where, again, we are at real risk when the Republicans take over, because all that money will be cut.
Well, that's fascinating. John, bring us home. We are at 2:29.
Okay. I like everything you all just said, and I had thought of the COVID next wave, which Mimi already mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Mimi's like, yeah,
I think this you make a lot of
Cheerful
sense.
dinner
I hate to say,
conversation.
I expect continuity when it comes to the Russian war. There are a few spoilers like Rand Paul. There may be some more in the House, but I really think they're not going to be that powerful. If anything, some of them think Biden's not doing enough. They're more hawkish on Russia instinctively, more hawkish on China. So one thing that could happen here is, because the Democrats emphasize climate change and the need to cooperate with China a lot more than the Republicans do, there might be, and climate, the need to cooperate with China on climate is one of the things that keeps the Biden administration focused on, the need to not enter a new Cold War. There may be less of a brake pedal. The Republicans may be less inclined to apply the brake pedal on getting tough on China, because they don't care as much about climate change. So there could be, if what I was talking about earlier, kind of decoupling, not a full-fledged Cold War, but less cooperation between the West and China, that could be actually accelerated marginally if the Republicans take the House. But I'm not expecting massive changes, because I don't think that there's an intellectual group, we can call them neo-isolationists in the Republican Party. They're not that, they're powerful, on Fox News, Tucker Carlson, on the web. I don't see much of a presence in Washington at this point. When it comes down to it, the Republicans, you get the joke that the old policies are still basically what they want, and that includes a kind of an internationalism of the kind of Reagan sort. So it's suspicious of multilateralism in the sense that the United States really is a sovereign country. We should be able to move freely and do what we want, but we do need to cooperate with like-minded countries. We're not in this alone. And so that's the kind of international I think is still reigning in the Republicans in Congress. That's my sense. So.
Neo-Gulliverism.
Yeah, neo-government.
Great phrase.
Yeah.
Wow, we coined lots of words here.
Dusting off my grad school credits. Well, thank you all. Great to include you again and see you in person. David and John, fun to travel here together. And thanks again to our friends at RA. I'm sorry we didn't get any questions from the audience, but Adam, maybe you can bring us to close for hosting this wonderful event.
Well, I just want to thank everybody again for coming. It's just such a pleasure that we have this ongoing relationship with the Miller Center, and long may it continue. So thank you all for this the two very stimulating panels. Thank you.